Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's CITRIS Research Exchange. I'm Brandie Nonnecke, the director of the CITRIS Policy Lab. Today, it's actually the 14th year of the CITRIS Research Exchange seminar series. We wish we could be with you in person, but we'll still do this through Zoom. We have hosted a remarkable lineup of technology innovators in person, and we're really glad to see you all today joining virtually. Today, we are joined by Alex Bustamante, who is Senior Vice President and Chief Compliance and Audit Officer in the UCOP Office of Ethics, Compliance, and Audit Services. Alex was the co-chair of the UC Presidential Working Group with me, and also Professor Stuart Russell, who is unable to join us today. Next, we have Camille Crittenden. She's the Executive Director of CITRIS and the Banatao Institute and co-founder of the CITRIS Policy Lab and the EDGE, Expanding Diversity and Gender Equity in Tech Initiative at UC. We're also joined by Professor Hany Farid. He has a joint appointment in electrical engineering and computer science and the School of Information. We also have Cora. She's Chief Health Data Officer at UC Health. And Alexa Koenig, she's the Executive Director of the Human Rights Center and a lecturer at UC Berkeley School of Law. All of these individuals were part of the UC Presidential Working Group on AI, and they all form the co-chairs of our 4 subcommittees. So I will hand it over now to Alex Bustamante.
Hey, thank you, Brandie. Throughout the University of California, we're constantly looking for opportunities to support greater efficiency, effectiveness, and equity in our operations. And recently, we've started looking at AI-enabled tools to kind of fill those gaps. And although there was a realization that AI held potential to improve our operations, there were also several ethical, privacy, equity, and security risks associated with these systems. At that same time, we also were noticing a realization that state and federal governments were increasing their efforts in this area because of the implicated economic and national security considerations. So because of those issues, the president of the university established a working group in August 2020 to address the concerns related to compliance and ethics with AI coming into our system, as well as position UC to withstand any regulatory efforts that would potentially affect our operations. And could I have slide 2, please? So the interdisciplinary working group was comprised of 32 faculty and staff from all of our 10 UC campuses, as well as representatives from our office, our UC Legal Office, our Office of Ethics, Compliance, and Audit Services, Procurement, Office of the Chief Information Officer, Research and Innovation, and UC Health, among others. And the members represented diverse disciplines, including computer science and engineering, law and policy, medicine, and social sciences. And the charge was to develop and operationalize a set of UC responsible AI principles that would guide the procurement, development, implementation, and monitoring of AI in ways that are consistent with the University of California's missions and values. So one of the ways to ensure that these issues were being addressed was creating an UC-wide mechanism to further the principles and guidance developed by the working group and to mitigate the harmful effects of AI and strengthen the positive outcomes within the UC system. Ready?
Great, thank you. We can move to the next slide. I just want to point out, and I'm very proud of this, we are the first university system to establish mechanisms to oversee AI and ensure that it's done in a responsible way. Of course, AI holds great promise to support efficiency, effectiveness, and equity, but ill-conceived deployments risk perpetuating bias and discrimination and other harmful effects. So I'm extremely proud of the work that we've done, and especially that we were very conscientious to not just provide overarching guidelines and principles at a high level, but we really tried to target that work down to implementation. So what does it mean to actually implement appropriate oversight mechanisms for responsible AI? Later on, Alex and I will talk about the next steps that we're taking in order to do that with the establishment of a UC-wide AI council. But before that, I actually want to talk a little bit about our report and the work that we did as part of the working group. In the chat, I've put a link to the UC Presidential Working Group on AI main webpage that has a link to its final report. For that work, for the final report, I want to highlight some of the methods that we used. Of course, we did a very robust literature review of how appropriate AI governance strategies have been implemented in the public sector and also in the private sector. We did a survey of campus CIOs and CTOs to get a better understanding of how pervasive AI-enabled technologies are across the UC system and the mechanisms that are put in place right now where there could be some oversight of AI-enabled tools. We also did dozens of interviews, most of those led by the subcommittees with key stakeholders within the various domains. Next slide, please. So as part of that literature review, we did a landscape analysis of responsible AI principles that are being implemented across the public and private sector. Now, this number of principles is constantly in flux, but I think the last time I looked, there's about 180 sets of responsible AI principles that have been established across public and private sector. And there is a convergence happening around the core principles within those sets. And so you can see here on the left, these are the responsible AI principles that were adopted by the UC system. And this was done over a period of time where we vigorously debated the principles and what it meant for the UC system. It's very important to have these principles because it sets the guardrails of where we want to go as an institution designing and deploying AI to support the UC system's service provision. Next slide, please. As I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, a big emphasis of our work was to make the work practical. So how do we actually operationalize those principles in practice? And so we identified 4 high-risk areas. So these are areas where AI is or could be applied within the UC system where it could pose greater than minimal risk to individual rights. So the first was on health, the second on human resources, the third was on policing, and the last was student experience. Now, student experience deals with the entire journey that students face as they go into university, all the way from admissions to the use of AI-enabled tools in correcting their homework or use in proctoring, or even chatbots used to help students navigate their academic career path. Next slide, please. So our final recommendations, I'll first pass it back over to Alex to give an update on the first 2 recommendations, and then I'll take the 3rd and 4th recommendations.
Thank you. The first 2 recommendations, the first one in particular was a realization that we needed to train people and educate them on some of the pitfalls and challenges related to AI-enabled systems. It was really reaching out to the decision makers and the people that are requesting the potential tool, but also procurement, which we believe were kind of the gatekeepers of any new technology that may come in. And so this recommendation really involves kind of an education and risk assessment process for the procurement folks throughout the system, as well as kind of an education suite for individuals that may be requesting kind of AI or some other tool that they believe is going to be necessary to improve their efficiencies. The second one was kind of a realization that this is an ongoing effort, that we needed an ongoing mechanism to ensure that we were constantly staying apprised of changes to the technology, changes to the legislative landscape, and also consistently engaging with our stakeholders throughout the community, the UC community. So there was a realization that some mechanism where there was close coordination with the campuses and with the Office of the President was necessary. And this gave birth to our system-wide AI Council, which has kind of a robust representation from the campuses, as well as kind of the SMEs throughout the system on the administrative side, to ensure that we have that ongoing constant dialogue and the mechanisms to get the information kind of deep into the organization and constantly stay on top of these issues as developments continue to occur.
Great, thank you, Alex. Actually, you can go back to the previous slide. Yeah, so we're very excited about the continuation of this work and the establishment of this system-wide UC AI Council. And a first objective of that UC AI Council is actually to develop a risk and impact assessment strategy when we are either procuring or designing an AI-enabled tool used in UC services. And this process is incredibly important because we need to understand, what technology are we developing or procuring? What are the potential risks, and what are the appropriate mechanisms that we must put in place to mitigate those risks to better ensure that UC can maximize the benefit that can be gleaned out of the use of that tool? Also, as part of our work is to develop a type of public database where the community, faculty, staff, and students will be made aware of the use of AI-enabled tools. From our analysis that we did for the report, we found out that right now there really isn't a strong mechanism in place for the documentation of AI-enabled tools. And we saw that as a very critical point that we needed to address. We need to be able to know where AI is being used, especially if its use may affect individual rights. Create more transparency around that, do a risk and impact assessment, ensure that appropriate safeguards are put in place. And so I'm very excited about the launch of that work and moving forward. We are definitely a leader in this space. Next slide, please. So now I'm very excited to turn it over to the co-chairs of the subcommittees. They'll each give about 5 minutes of remarks, highlighting key insights from the work of their subcommittee and the next work that they see moving forward. So I'll pass it over to Cora to talk about the health subcommittee's work.
Great. Thanks, Brandie, and thanks to CITRIS for having me here today. So the health subcommittee examined the use of AI-enabled tools across UC health operations, examined the risks and benefits of those tools, and then developed a set of recommendations to mitigate risks that were identified and really promote the use of AI in an ethical and responsible manner. In the report, the group described 3 use cases, and I'll touch on those, and then perhaps they implicated a number of principles, but I'll maybe mention just 1 or 2 of the principles that each case study touched upon. The first was the use of AI in scheduling. The group examined a scheduling AI tool that would enhance scheduling by reducing no-shows. One of the issues raised by the group and the group at the location that examined the tool was that of fairness and non-discrimination, and the need to really examine what the root causes of no-shows were to ensure that use of the tool wouldn't impact groups unfairly. The second case study that the group examined was the use of AI in medical imaging. And the group in particular looked at an AI screening tool that works with a portable X-ray machine to screen patients for collapsed lung. Ultimately, that tool was approved by the FDA and became the first FDA-cleared on-device point-of-view care use of AI in 2019. One of the principles implicated by that case study was accuracy, reliability, and safety. And the group really focused on and emphasized the importance of validation and external validation to ensure that, that tools perform as intended in the clinical environment. And then the third use case examined was in the population health context, and it was development of a population health risk model to predict the risk of hospitalization and/or emergency department visits over the next 12 months in primary care patients. The principle I'll call out there is that of fairness and non-discrimination. When the group focused on developing that tool, they were very focused on the potential that the model could incorporate bias and systemically perpetuate perhaps racial discrimination that had been identified in other research studies. And so the team developed a proxy that was intended to mitigate that risk, and that was something that was described in the report. So several recommendations that this subgroup came up with. First, development and implementation of an AI risk and impact assessment framework consistent with what Brandie just described. Second, encouraging documentation practices for AI systems to facilitate assessment, transparency, auditing, and oversight. Third, the group recommended developing and incorporating standardized, reproducible, and meaningful processes for human review at appropriate checkpoints throughout the entire AI lifecycle. So picking up exactly on what Alex was saying about how this is an ongoing issue that always needs to be examined. Fourth, encouraging representation, engagement, and feedback from the UC community and all relevant external stakeholders as well. Fifth, providing training and education programs and ensuring the adequate allocation of funds so that those programs can move forward in an effective manner. Sixth, developing guidelines for AI procurement, as Brandie described. And seven, the group identified further areas for research, and that includes potential and experience benefits and risks of AI in healthcare and compliance with relevant laws and regulations. So with that, I'll turn it over to the next speaker. Thanks, Brandie.
Great, thank you so much. And next will be Alexa Koenig talking about the work of the Human Resources Subcommittee.
Thank you, Brandie, and thank you to you and of course to Alex and Stuart for all of your leadership throughout this process and to CITRIS for hosting. As Brandie mentioned, I was the co-chair of the Human Resources Subcommittee. This was a project that all of us on the subcommittee were really interested in part because the stakes seemed particularly high. There are more than 185,000 people employed by the University of California system. It's one of the largest employers in the state. So both the issues of employee satisfaction and also of job opportunities in the future seemed especially acute. One of the first things that we found was that certain forms of artificial intelligence are not yet commonly used at many of the stages of HR experiences, all the way from recruitment through separation. However, they seem to be coming, and there's a lot happening right now in both the legislative space and also in terms of experimenting with different applications. What we did find more of was examples of robotic process automation, or RPA, in part because we were finding that a lot of the very rote processes that people might engage in through their employment were being automated. So what did we do? We evaluated the current use of and prospective opportunities for and the hazards of using AI software and related data-driven programs across 5 employee lifecycle roles, so 5 different groups of people. We had, of course, small group consultation among the different experts that were in the group who had expertise in everything from human resources to tech. And then finally, desk research, who has looked at this already and what's already known. And it was very difficult actually to find any kind of comprehensive overviews, although a few of them some research has been done and more is coming. And then finally, we interviewed other experts on these issues. In terms of the 5 categories of employees that we looked at applicants for these positions, prospective employees, new employees, current employees, and retired employees. There was quite a bit of deliberation as to whether we should think of student employees as well, but ultimately made the determination that that was being covered by Camille's committee. We also looked at the ways that artificial intelligence was increasingly being utilized across 8 stages of the human resources experience, which I'll describe in a second. And then what we found is that AI is being used to change how work gets done. It's making operations more efficient, it's supporting better decision-making, and it's freeing up workers from repetitive tasks. In the HR context, it's taking the following forms: certainly speech recognition and natural language processing for sentiment analysis, for example. Computer vision and optical character recognition is being used, for example, to scan different resumes for potential job suitability and trying to recruit people to these positions. We're seeing it used in rule-based systems and for predictive analytics, for example, predicting some kind of team turnover or retention, as well as machine learning and deep learning being used to scan recruitment sites. And then finally, in the RPA context, shifting these routine and repetitive tasks from humans increasingly to machines. In terms of the 8 stages that we really investigated, the first was pre-recruitment, where we may even see the use of artificial intelligence being integrated into the creation of job descriptions that may attract a broader demographic of applicants than previously, and also to identify and assess different qualifications that may be particularly helpful in certain kinds of job functions. Second, we looked at recruitment, where we assessed the use of AI for these recruitment processes. And this was one area where we did see AI increasingly being used, as well as in addition to kind of combing through large quantities of resumes, et cetera, to conduct candidate assessments and to set appropriate salaries with an eye toward equity. However, we also identified within that cluster potential privacy issues. So basically looking at people's social media feeds and what that might mean for privacy interests. And then, of course, the increasing use of AI to try to game systems and recruitment mechanisms that are being used. The third was onboarding. So AI is being used right now to document new hire data and to automate those transactional processes, among other functions. We're also seeing it used in employee well-being and engagement. So how different kinds of wellness support might be streamlined. For existing employees, we also see it increasingly used in learning and development. So first identifying potential employees who may be ready for future development opportunities and to improve learners' experience. Finally, additionally, on career development and advancement, identifying people who are potentially ready to advance. Again, looking at these issues of equity and salary increases and the risks that that might pose. In terms of separation, we focused on really two very different kinds of issues. The first was AI as a tool to support the separation process. For example, automating people being logged out of different systems across the UC platforms. And then also AI is something that is increasingly replacing human functions, which raises the ethical question of what obligation the UC system has to retrain people when AI is increasingly becoming part of the functioning of this work. And since I'm at time, I will just end with the final stage, which is post-separation, thinking through the ways that this can come into better pension planning and better long-term ripple effects that may have come from the employment context. And hopefully I'll have some time to talk a little bit more about the recommendations that we identified. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexa. And yes, you will definitely have time. I'm happy that you brought up this need to discuss obligations of UC, which we'll get into more in our discussion. I'll pass it now to Hany Farid, who will talk about policing.
Thank you, Brandie. Let me start by saying I'd be doing a disservice to our subcommittee if I didn't begin by saying that our members really struggled. Our subcommittee was established to consider the use of AI in policing across the UC system. And you'll remember that at the time, in early 2021, when we began our work, we were all seeing deeply troubling and heartbreaking reports of police violence against citizens, and particularly people of color. It was our feeling that a discussion of the use of AI in policing was at best misguided and at worst at odds with creating a safe and equitable society. And it was argued, for example, that if an officer is unable to distinguish between a taser and a handgun, which led just last year to the police killing of Daunte Wright, it didn't really make sense for us to be discussing placing in the hands of police sophisticated AI technologies. And it was in this backdrop that we really struggled to whether we could even carry out our mission. And after some patient discussion with Alex and with Brandie, for which we were grateful, and a lot of debate, we did find a way to move forward. And I'm going to briefly summarize our findings here. The Subcommittee on AI and Policing was established to broadly investigate the use of AI, algorithmic decision-making, and network technologies across the UC system. And although the use cases at the time within the UC system are currently limited, many large-scale databases and AI-driven technologies are already in use in local and national policing and have or may be considered by UCPD police. Many of these tools were adopted without consideration of their objectives or effects, and can, in fact, exacerbate or amplify existing racial disparities in policing that have rightly become the focus of a national conversation. Given the civil liberties implications and the examples of policing abuses nationwide, the use of these tools in policing at UC should be particularly and extremely carefully scrutinized, was our finding. The subcommittee considered how AI technologies are currently or may be incorporated into various aspects of campus policing. And to begin, we identified three application areas. One, deterrence. And AI-enabled tools can be used to deter crime through, for example, visible surveillance cameras with automated technology to detect criminal activity. Additionally, police body and vehicle cameras can reduce police misconduct and false claims of police misconduct. Two, prevention. AI-enabled tools can be used to guide police patrols to high-risk areas, provide early warnings of criminal activity based on video surveillance, and through automated facial recognition, identify, for example, individuals on campus who have previously been issued no trespass orders. And three, investigation. The use of camera surveillance and automated facial or license plate recognition can be used to analyze footage of crimes in order to identify or exonerate suspects. Additionally, automated and large-scale analysis of social media posts can uncover evidence of past crimes. Campus police are understandably increasingly turning to AI-enabled technologies to support greater efficiency and effectiveness in policing. Campus police have, for example, turned to facial recognition, automated license plate readers, and social media data in an attempt to deter, prevent, and investigate crimes. The subcommittee spent the majority of our time studying these three technologies: facial recognition, automated license plate readers, and scraping of social media data, to understand how they can be both used to further public safety, but also how they could be misused to threaten civil liberties. While these three AI applications may seem promising, we found that they simultaneously pose serious risks to privacy, security, and civil liberties. As such, we are not able to yet recommend their deployment without significantly more thought and development of appropriate safeguards. And to this end, I'll summarize our three primary findings that the UC engage in the following next steps. Ensure appropriate oversight and assessment prior to the procurement and use of any AI-enabled tools in policing. Develop a database that inventories and tracks all uses and versions of AI-enabled tools used in policing, including system updates, vendors, documentation, and disclosures. And third, perform periodic review of all forms of AI used in policing and require that all vendors provide explainable and transparency of said technologies, including publicly disclosing which data they use to develop those technologies. Thanks, Brandie.
Great, thank you so much, Hany. I'll now turn to Camille Crittenden to give an update on the Student Experience Subcommittee.
Thank you, Brandie. I want to acknowledge my co-conspirators on the subcommittee. It was a really exciting group and very multidisciplinary, with participants from a number of the CITRIS campuses as well as UCOP. So what do we mean by student experience? This was a really interesting area for us to explore, and very germane, of course, to the university's mission. For this investigation, we looked at the student experience from a variety of touch points along the journey that a student or prospective student might engage with the university. So that starts with the admissions and financial aid application process, thinking about application to the UCs overall, what that acceptance experience is like, through intent to enroll, registration, their actual appearance on campus, and the idea of trying to reduce summer melt, or that diminution of the students who have suggested that they intend to come, but then don't, for whatever reason, actually end up enrolling in the fall. We also looked then at retention. Once the students got on campus, how was AI being used to facilitate retention, student advising, and facilitate academic progress? Again, once they're here on campus, how can we support students' mental health and wellness? This came to be a very prominent area of investigation and promise, actually, for the students over the time that we were looking, because many of them were remote. A few were on campus but were in quarantine for COVID-related reasons, so attending to student mental health was a real concern. And then finally, looking at applications of grading and proctoring. We stayed away from this for the most part because we didn't want to verge into the jurisdiction of the academic senate and the faculty members, but we did offer some observations and cautions about how, especially in the remote environment, test proctoring was being handled. A number of applications had sprung up over the last year, especially for trying to ensure that the validity of the students who were taking the tests, but they also, of course, had some problematic features, and looking at automated facial recognition and tools like that that were problematic. So let me dive into those areas just a little bit, and I'm going to divide my remarks into two categories. So one being the student-facing applications, which often involve chatbots, and then the other would be more on the operational side from the back end. But talking about the student-facing apps and the chatbots, I think there's really a lot of promise and exciting opportunity here to engage with students in a new way. There are some platforms that are able to engage with students by tracking their activities on campus. So for instance, if students badge in to check out a book, or to use a lab, or to even go to the dining hall, there are some platforms that can flag students who haven't shown up in class or who haven't gone to the dining hall in a while. And then that can be flagged, and real humans or counselors can go follow up with them. I should say that these are apps and platforms that are available generally, not to say that UC is using these at any of the individual campuses. Like some of the other subcommittees, we tried to get a handle on what was happening at the different campuses and interviewed a number of, say, admissions officers, but I don't pretend to have a comprehensive knowledge of the apps and platforms that are being used. But we do have some evidence of their use in other contexts, in other large public university systems, or even in the CSU system. Chatbots have the advantage of being able to answer routine questions, so students can ask via text, what time does the library open, or when is my financial aid application due? Things like this can relieve the workload for employees as well, if they don't have to respond to these routine inquiries, that it helps them, and it also helps the students to get timely information. And of course, if the students are asking questions that can't be answered in a routine kind of way, then that can also be escalated or forwarded. Another advantage of chatbots is that they can often accommodate a range of languages. So you can have applications that are able to respond in Spanish or Vietnamese or Chinese or other languages where you might not have that capacity in human employees to respond quickly. They can also respond outside of business hours. So students, of course, might not keep the same hours as our on-campus employees, and they might have questions that come up outside of the 9 to 5 business hours. Often I should say that students also attend more to texts. Our traditional in the last decade or so, ways of communicating with students via email is less and less popular among students, and that they tend to read their texts far more often than they might, say, read their email and to respond. So those are some of the sort of incoming examples. There could also be examples where the universities might use the text in a proactive way, so to nudge the students. Did you know that your financial aid application form is due in 2 weeks? So those kinds of proactive reminders, also about, say, tracking, perhaps their homework progress. Finishing your reading and completing your homework is an important part of your grade. You still have time to do it before the end of the semester. Those kinds of nudges, using that kind of behavioral information is very useful to help keep students on track and improve their persistence and performance. The financial aid application reminders is also especially useful for students who are returning. So they might remember when they first come into the university that this is part of what they have to do, but they might forget that they have to reapply in year 2. So these kinds of automated encouragements can be very useful. The academic support can also be helpful for students to track their progress and to make sure, especially for first generation students perhaps that haven't had the experience or learned from family members or others about some of the culture and practices of being successful at college, that this kind of automation is also very helpful. So moving to some of the health and wellness apps and mental health apps, these are also proven to be quite helpful even when the student knows that it's an automated chatbot that's responding to them. They feel happy or at least heard that some entity is listening to what they might have to say, whether they have concerns or health questions, that even if they know they're getting automated responses, that this is something that can be useful. And again, the advantages of being able to respond in a non-English language, say, is very helpful, being able to respond outside of typical work hours. It also helps the university to kind of keep their fingertips on some of the concerns more broadly or at scale with students. So if they're hearing a lot about COVID concerns or hearing from a particular dorm that there are certain concerns, that can help the universities respond in a more targeted way to some of those as well. Another thing that people have found in the research, especially again for, say, first generation students or perhaps non-English speakers, is that it reduces the barrier to engagement, that students might not feel as embarrassed or self-conscious about asking some questions of an automated tool as they might a human. So you're able to achieve a higher degree of honesty, perhaps in the questions and concerns that students have because of the automation. The various companies or vendors that are selling these tools will often customize them to give them, cute names that are related perhaps to the mascot of the school, and that helps also to increase familiarity or that sense of it. So those are some of the applications like with the chat bots that are really student facing. On the operational side, again, it can really help by implementing some of these screening tools or algorithms. The incredible workload that some of our staff are facing, say in admissions, you probably heard that UC had a record number of applicants this year. So imagine that all of the schools have to read and clean the data, make sure that these are complete applications, and to personally read every application. Some schools do, but there are also some AI algorithms that could be used perhaps to at least make sure that the time is being used the most efficiently by the admissions and review committees. Also for mental health, I know that the demands for mental health services far exceed the supply that colleges and universities can offer. So implementing at least some level of automated support can be helpful and let the counselors really focus on the students who have the greatest need at a particular time. So these sorts of tools, of course, are useful mostly for large organizations, and some of the vendors that you'll see out there have worked with other large public universities. Georgia State has a big contract. I think California State universities at various locations have used these tools to varying degrees. So I think UC has an opportunity here to look at best practices, learn from the lessons of other universities, and perhaps implement them in ways that would be beneficial for the universities. Just to return to the question of test proctoring, of course, that also has been shown to be problematic with the facial recognition tools. You might have read during the COVID period about these platforms that were meant to increase the likelihood that the student who said they were taking the test actually were, or that they weren't using outside resources. But a lot of these platforms are also problematic as far as facial recognition, even recognizing that there is a student there. It works differently for students of different skin tones, and there were other problems with those as well. So again, proceed with extreme caution when looking at those. So maybe I'll just close with offering a few cautions, and these will mirror a lot of what you've heard already about encouraging schools to really develop robust policies around data privacy, data security, and storage, especially with these student-facing apps. We want to make sure that that it's transparent for the students, what kind of information is being gathered about them, how it's being used, how long the school will keep it, what access they have to it, what rights do they have to request deletion of the data. So those are all good questions to ask. Some vendors have been using these tools for research purposes, and in that case, I would encourage the universities to have them go through the IRB process, perhaps on their campuses if they're using it for research. And finally, I would just say to include students as important stakeholders when universities are evaluating the implementation or adoption of some of these platforms. You know, the students know their own interests and their own rights, and they should be involved in making decisions about these platforms that will affect them. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Camille. Before I jump into the discussion, I want to first thank all of the co-chairs of the subcommittees. It was really no small feat for them to try to take stock of how AI is used within their application domain, and then especially how to translate the principles and guidance from the report to sub-recommendations for their subcommittee. So I'm just incredibly grateful for the hard work that you put in. I know it's going to be impactful, and look forward to continuing to draw insights from that work as we move forward. The subcommittee co-chairs today presented many use case applications of AI within their subject matter domain, including some of those benefits and risks. And both Camille and others have hinted at some of the requirements that they think the University of California system should put in place to enable appropriate oversight, like data privacy, data ownership guidelines. So I'd like to first open it up to the panelists. What do you think are some of the steps that the university must take moving forward? So I encourage you all to turn on your cameras, and you can go ahead and just unmute yourself and jump in. I'd also like to encourage those watching, please add questions to the Q&A. We see a few coming in, but I encourage you to post your questions there.
So I'll just there are many. I absolutely agree with the the data privacy and security issues. I agree with the transparency and all of the recommendations. One of the things that I feel like hasn't quite been touched on yet, but I think is important in this work is to bring together. It's really interdisciplinary work, so it really requires the bringing together of collaborators and stakeholders and experts across different domains. And I think, we've talked about procurement, we've talked about, privacy. I think, those can be in any large system kind of siloed. And so it's I think, important to bring together the diverse voices to really hammer out some of these issues, which are cross-cutting.
And if I can piggyback on that, and I think to also piggyback on what Camille said about students, I think really ensuring the engagement and opportunity to be part of the process for those who are most impacted, whether it's through the human resources process, a student, et cetera, is going to be really critical. And that shouldn't be considered a one and done, where it's a one-off consultation, but that there's a mechanism for ongoing feedback and integration, and a chance to really reflect as these things increasingly come into processes to give that feedback to the people who are really driving decision making around this. And then I think also just having additional research, and I think Cora and others touched on this as well, is that what we were able to do in these subcommittees was a very intense amount of work for a year-long period, but it barely scratches the surface. And I think having a chance to have a more research-informed plan for each of these areas of potential application is going to be really critical. I think the exciting thing from the human resources standpoint is because there's not a lot of AI being used yet outside of kind of robotics. I think there's a real opportunity here to get ahead of the potential downstream effects. And maybe I'll just mention one other thing to get that squeezed in. I think the salaries conversation and the ability to use AI to maximize diversity, equity, and inclusion across the UC system was probably the most heated conversation that we had among our team. I think there was broad recognition that in some ways we really do need machines to augment what humans have, given human biases, but also understanding that machines have biases of their own and they need to be acting as a check upon each other. And of course, if there's really bad historic data coming in that's driving these systems, it's going to be a little opaque at times, or maybe opaque about that fact, but we're going to need to have some form of auditing and safeguarding.
I'll add something to what Alexis said, and I think this is we've been talking about AI, but I think there's an important distinction here that we should understand, is that what we're really talking about is machine learning, not AI. And there is a world of a difference between pattern recognition, which is what machine learning is and what neural nets do, and artificial intelligence, which is really having an understanding of the world and what the issues are. And if Stuart were here, he would tell you this much more eloquently than I would. But to Alexa's point, if you train a machine learning algorithm on historical data, and that historical data has biases against people of color or women or whatever it is, well, guess what? You've just institutionalized the bias all over again. So, just because the recommendation is coming from a machine learning algorithm doesn't make it good or better. And arguably, sometimes it's worse because of the lack of transparency, the lack of explainability, and the lack of accountability. So we have to be very careful here to tread lightly as we are training these algorithms. And we have seen this. Amazon, for example, trained an algorithm on the human resources side to review resumes to determine who got to talk to a human being. And they trained it on historical data. And what they realized after unleashing this program and using it was that the algorithm was biased against women. And so any resume that said, women's volleyball, women's chess, whatever it was, would get docked. Why? Well, because Amazon and the technology sector have historically hired far fewer women. And so the algorithm said, okay, women aren't as good as men. And it just institutionalized it in an algorithm that was not particularly transparent. And so these things are happening. And so we have to tread very lightly here on these data-driven approaches.
Can I just add to that, Hany? I totally agree with you, of course. But that's also not to say that humans themselves aren't biased. So we have to think about what the alternative is.
Of course, the original bias data came from the human biases, right? What I worry about is we unleash the algorithm and say, okay, we've fixed society's problem, that in fact we've just made them a little bit worse.
And at scale.
And
right?
at scale,
so you've
that's
amplified
right.
it.
That's right. We can do it. We can do it efficiently now.
Yeah, exactly. So that would be my recommendation. Following on what others have said, is just to have that ongoing process of auditing. Really looking at once you've adopted an algorithm, say to look, how well is this working? What needs to be tweaked? We need to keep a constant eye on it.
And I'll just add right on to the end. So exactly, right, your data set has to be representative. You have to have checks in place to do everything you can to ensure that that's the case, but also throughout the whole life cycle. And another, I think, risk point is when you try to use a model developed for one purpose for a different purpose. So that is, clearly a point at which you have to, go back and re-examine, okay, is this data set reflective for that purpose? Is the proxy that you're using to measure what it is that you would like to measure also appropriate?
I don't know if there's space to add one more thing, but I think also thinking about how the use of AI comes into workflows, for example, like who's going to train people how to use those machines when they maybe historically done their job in very different ways. If they are replaced by AI or their job function goes away, are we going to retrain them to do other functions within the University of California system? Or are we going to let them go and hire up a very different population? I think from an equity perspective and some of the principles that were implicated by our report, also thinking through what that means about the age of the people who may become suitable for these positions. Are there issues of ethnicity and gender that we may be inadvertently bringing in that we're not even aware of? And I think that is where the research and the learning from other contexts can be helpful.
Great. I'm really happy that we've also brought up the role of research. And Hany, when you were giving the example from Amazon Web Services, or I guess maybe it was Web Services, but Amazon in their review of resumes, it made me think actually how people try to trick machine learning algorithms by putting in certain Ivy League school names in their resume in white text. So the individual reviewing doesn't see it, but the machine learning model does see it. And, just bringing up that end users are also reinforcing some of these biases because they know that it's likely the system might pick up their resume if these certain characteristics are included. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about and have, insights from all of you about that risk assessment process, because that is one of the key priorities of the UC AI Council, is to develop a robust risk and impact assessment process that can be scaled across AI applications within the UC system, hopefully before procurement and hopefully before any development or implementation. So I'd like to hear from all of you. What do you think should be in that process?
I think, of course, consultation with the people who are going to use them. So in the admissions process, for example, I would love to see a conversation among all of the admissions directors at all of the campuses, as well as those at UCOP, to have this discussion about like what would be useful and what are the obstacles to a successful implementation of some of these tools. Like we heard some very basic, you talked about RPA, some very basic tools that would be useful before you even get to the automation and algorithms and AI. Like I think that those are probably underused in a system as big as ours, that I think there are some economies of scale that some of this automation could really help and improve our employee satisfaction, say, and perhaps the overall experience, and allow us to redeploy resources to areas that might be ultimately more productive.
I would add to that. I think making sure that it's not the opportunity to potentially use AI-based technologies that is driving these conversations, but that it's an articulation of needs that are happening within different functions, whether it's on the human resources side or students or policing, et cetera, so that we're not experimenting on human beings in a way with their use of AI, but we're really saying we have a problem that we need to solve within our sector. And maybe AI is one of 10 different directions you could go, and really thinking about what's best fit for purpose, which I think gets to what Hany was talking about earlier.
Yeah, I'd like to piggyback on that really quickly, because I think that is critical in the procurement process. So often you see vendors coming in trying to tell you have a problem that you might not already have. So I think it has to be driven by the units saying, look, we're inundated with applications. We need to figure out a way to do this better, of course, in a responsible way. So I think really that needs to be part of that risk and impact assessment process, that the entity looking to use some type of new technology or new process, they've clearly defined their problem before they start turning to machine learning, because that opens up a whole can of worms. Now, talking about research, we have a great question posed in the chat from David Grosef. talking about the role of actually engaging our faculty and students in doing some of that research. So let me just read out his question here. How much thought has been given of the research opportunity for students as well as faculty to participate in the design and analysis of AL or machine learning guided AI or machine learning guided experiments on students? I ask this because you've just spoken of using machine learning to nudge, of course, in Sustain's work and nudging behavior. So what about opening that tool design up for multi-site studies and student projects, et cetera?
I love this idea. The one concern I have is data privacy, because all of these algorithms have to use data from real human beings. And so we'd have to think very carefully about how we could do this in a way that would protect the privacy and the security of the data that we've collected from employees and from students. I like the idea a lot. Anything that engages students and faculty in solving these problems, I think is great, but I think we'd have to tread very lightly here.
So Hany, just a question. What do you think about synthetic data sets? Is there a way that you could use non-identified or?
Sure. Well, so there's a couple of things you could do. You could try to scrub PII. That can be very tricky and very time consuming. You can try to use synthetic data sets. The problem, of course, is synthetic data sets may not represent the real world. And so then the algorithms trained on that don't quite really work or generalize in the real world. So I don't think it's a no, from my perspective, but I think we would just want to be a little careful on how we did that.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you for defining that.
So, and I'll just say, so absolutely. You can de-identify, you can put it in a secure enclave, but also there are, particularly when there are students, I think there is also the need to kind of, just tread carefully, just because there's always the potential for re-identification of any data. So, so always an issue for researchers, but I guess the question would be when we bring in students, is there sort of any other calculation? And there may not be, but it is something worth sort of thinking through carefully.
And somebody mentioned this earlier, I'm sorry, I don't remember who, but this would absolutely need very careful IRB approval if we're going to do anything here in this space. Even with de-identified data, I think we'd have to think very carefully about it.
A great point. I'm going to grab another question here that was posed by Jonathan Feinstein. I'm concerned that once we begin relying upon the efficiency of offloading tasks to machines, we will not leave time or attention to consider alternatives. Have you considered how to leave adequate slack in the system? Good question.
And that's a great question. From my end, no, but now I have, and I think it's an important question. And I think Brandie also said something earlier too, which I think is right, is just because we have a problem doesn't mean that AI is the solution. This is the popular buzzword these days, but it doesn't mean it's the right answer. And I think we should think very carefully about, what is the nature of the problem, and then what are the right set of tools. And I would actually argue the minimal set of tools. I love my chainsaw, and I pull it out at every moment I can. And my wife often asks me, do you really need that? And my answer is, it's not a question of need. And AI is sort of like that. It's like the chainsaw, right? It's like the big bazooka, and you don't always need it. Sometimes a much lighter weight tool can actually solve the problem and create some oxygen in the room for us to think about things going forward.
I would add to that efficiency is just one of the values that I think we should be thinking about when we're talking about AI. So a certain thing that definitely emerged repeatedly in the human resources subgroup was how your sense of belonging, your sense of wellness, your sense of being an important contributor to the UC system was really important to figure out how we, continue to foster and maybe even strengthen that with the plans that we have going forward. And if there's barely a trade-off in terms of efficiencies, we're having to juggle that with a lot of other social values that we need to consider.
I really like your analogy, Hany, about the chainsaw and the bazooka and AI. Imagine at your house there aren't any branches. It's about 7.5 feet, your arm's length. But that, I think, carries over to AI, and that if you apply it across all of your problem spots, you're cutting off those branches, those opportunities that might, if you left them there and trimmed them a little, they might actually bear fruit. So I think that's an interesting analogy.
That was a nice closing of that analogy. By the way, you should see there's no fruit on any of the trees in my house. So
Yeah.
Go figure.
Yeah, there's no branches to bear that fruit. There was another point posted by Avi Rosenberg, and that talking about, we focus a lot on the AI application areas that we know pose significant risk, like in policing. But we often don't think about HR, which has that direct effect on our daily lives. So I'm thinking also about the work of UC and this UC AI Council moving forward, and how we can best demonstrate to the entire UC community that we have to be conscientious of these other application areas that might, at first blush, we don't think that there's that great risk. So I'm curious, we highlighted those 4 subcommittee areas: health, HR, policing, and student experience. Are there other areas where we should be focusing our work? Specifically, of course, our work is going to span across a variety of areas, but is there any particular area we should raise up?
Well, if I could maybe just build on the student experience, I said that we didn't really explore much about automation in, say, grading or in test proctoring and things like that. I would love to see a faculty council group take up some of those questions, because I realize that, especially for some of these really large entry-level courses, that automation could both be used productively to help increase student persistence and success, but also should be used cautiously in order not to reinforce biases or to present greater difficulties to certain populations for finishing the course or being successful. But we deliberately kind of stayed away from that area, but that's an area where I'd love to see further work done.
Be interested when we get the AI Council stood up and we started engaging with stakeholders throughout the system on what other areas start to emerge. Since once we started having conversations with, all the different areas and all equally have the resource strains and the other concerns and issues, what other things pop up that we're going to have to address? And I think that's probably one of the great things about having this standing AI council, is it can kind of iterate and adapt and evolve and make sure that there's that constant dialogue necessary. So to me, that's a little bit of a safety net, given that we can't foresee all the areas that may be implicated and what those concerns may be.
Great, thank you so much. I'd like to thank all of the panelists and give you just a quick opportunity if there's any last remarks that you want to make. Otherwise, I'll close this out for today. No, we're good. Thank you all so much for joining. Thank you again for your service on the UC Presidential Working Group on AI. I encourage everybody to attend the next CITRIS Research Exchange. And I want to point out that the video from today will be posted on the CITRIS YouTube channel very soon. Great. Thank you again. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Brandie.
Thank you.